Hello, Year 12. This is Mr. Ferreira here, and I'm going to be talking you through the dispositional explanations for obedience. Now, this is a big move for us because we are looking at disposition. So this is who you are, okay? And it's saying that an explanation for obedience is who you are. Now, this is a big shift from what we've seen previously because we have Ash, Zimbardo, and Milgram all kind of saying that you do things because of the situation you find themselves in. Now, we're going to say the person that you are is the reason for the behavior. Now, it's not just looking at it as in every kind of ordinary context. We're looking specifically at the authoritarian personality. So it's saying that the authoritarian person or the person who has an authoritarian personality is going to be the reason why they are more obedient. And because the reason this comes up is because people were critical of Milgram, and so therefore not all psychologists were saying that they believe the situational factors. And some were saying, no, it must be down to who you are as a personality. Now, of course, I don't expect you to know lots about personality. And in lessons, I kind of described that if you wanted to go on something like this, the Myers-Briggs personality test, you can potentially kind of just tap away and you'll find different types of personalities. And then once you've worked out what your personality is, you can just choose what it is, and it will pretty much go to that particular kind of a choice that you may well have. Okay, so that will help you understand your personality. Now, the point of this is that if you do know your personality, you may be able to understand some things that you are compelled to do or some things you might not want to do, and understand kind of other people. So tests like the Myers-Briggs, and there's Eysenck and a few others who've done personality tests through the ages, could help us understand who we are. And so there are going to be several dispositional explanations for who we are, and several of them will also explain obedience. But what we are not going to do is look at all those other explanations. We're going to look at one explanation specifically, and that's the authoritarian personality. So here I have a definition of the authoritarian personality, and everything after this will actually be quite repetitive because this is quite a good explanation. So all it simply says is the person who has an authoritarian personality has rigid beliefs, is intolerant of ambiguity, submissive to authority, and hostile to those of a lower status or outgroup. Okay, so rigid beliefs, simple as quite straightforward. It's either one way or it's another. There's nothing in between. So therefore, you could have beliefs about things like gender, about roles in society, about race groups. And so therefore, that's what you have is rigid beliefs. We also find that they don't like this word ambiguity. Ambiguity, or they might like the word, but they don't like ambiguity, is if you're ambiguous, you don't actually have a clear preference. So for example, you might love or hate something. That's kind of clear to the person, but kind of being in the middle. So you could even understand how somebody with these types of personality might not understand how somebody could choose to identify as non-binary, for example, or transsexual, because it was saying, well, no, what are you? They want some clear answers, to become quite intolerant to that. And so you can see that they fit into a nice hierarchy where things are kind of fit in particular roles. And so, as such, they end up being submissive to authority. And we also find that they don't like people of a lower status to them. Now, within my definition, we can also say it's because of the parenting that they're in this particular situation. So, and I'm going to explain later how this leads to high levels of obedience. Because if you have an authoritarian parent with rigid beliefs who's intolerant towards ambiguity, who believes in kind of different social roles, they may have expected certain things from you, and that would certainly be obedience, and so therefore you learn all about it. So to take us into specifically understanding where do we get this authoritarian personality, we first turn to a person called Adorno, and he did research on trying to understand people's unconscious attitudes. So you see unconscious, so he's quite a Freudian type of way of thinking, that he would give people kind of questionnaires, and the question would hopefully dig into their unconscious and bring things to the surface. He did a number of different scales. It says several different scales, but the one that we're going to use is this fascism scale, or the F scale, and this was then later used as a measure, it says, of authoritarian personality. And there's a website that's very kindly given us access to that F scale, and it actually allows you to fill out the questionnaires. And what we find is that the questions themselves are quite tricky in many ways, and there's kind of a hidden meaning behind many of them. So we see, for example, obedience and respect for authority are the most important virtues children should learn. Okay, so that's quite important. We see this idea, the most important virtues. So of course you might be thinking, oh, children are not listening to their parents, they're kind of, that's why the country is kind of bad, or any of those type of things. And so yes, of course that's it. But I suppose somebody else, maybe somebody like myself, I think kindness and consideration towards other people is a really important virtue, and I perhaps would like that type of virtue, or honesty would be quite a good virtue as well. And so therefore, you can see how this could trick me into thinking, oh yes, children are running rampant, they need to listen to their parents. I love this next one, I didn't use it in class. There's hardly anything lower than a person who does not feel great love, gratitude, and respect for his parents. So, of course, you can see the type of parenting style potentially that we're producing if you say yes, strongly agree to that particular statement. And so when Adorno uses this F scale and looks at people's attitudes, he then kind of says, okay, people have this authoritarian leaning. They are likely to be authoritarian personalities if they identify as strong people or have contempt of weak people. So they're contemptuous, means you've heard it in terms of contempt of court, where you kind of don't kind of have any consideration for the rules that do exist. And once again, repeating this idea of rigid thinkers, and very conscious of people's status, it came up. They also agree with this ambiguity, they call it fuzziness, between categories. So we need to have very clear lines that divide people from one way or the other. And of course, the unfortunate negative aspect of this, because it is talking about politically left and right, that people who lean towards fascism would probably rely on stereotypes. And we see there's a positive correlation between authoritarianism and prejudice. So they're more likely to be prejudiced if you have high authoritarian leanings. Because, look at something like fascist like Hitler, who believed in the Aryan race being superior to everyone else. Of course, that means you have to be prejudiced towards anyone who's not Aryan. So Adorno does kind of go on to this and talk about the fact that they have great respect for authority. So that explains why they are more obedient. If you don't respect authority, therefore you might not listen to authority. But if you do, you will. We also find other things. It says, contempt for people who are inferior to them. So, of course, that's down to the hierarchy. Conventional attitudes towards sex, race, and gender. So, heterosexual, white, male is possibly the stereotype that we're looking at, the person who believes that they are superior in every way. But of course, we know that that in itself is quite destructive. We also have this phrase, going to the dogs, and it's really quite important that we recognize that this research was done in the 1950s. And even back then, they would have looked at how things had changed in society and said, this is disgraceful. Society is going to the dogs. But of course, people say that now. Maybe you look at what's happened in America and the UK and kind of talk about how negative things are, that it's going to the dogs. And he used a classic example of Cartwright, I forget the character from South Park, who talks about bowing to our authority, but having no authority. Now, this could also help us understand why they have a very high sense of why they should obey. And Adorno says that these people were raised by parents who had authoritarian parenting style. And that's a typical style that says strict discipline. And this phrase of absolute loyalty is quite important. So if I'm believing that somebody has to be absolutely loyal, what I'm believing is that they can't even question me, because that would show that they don't believe in me. And of course, the use of physical punishment would be a very typical way of disciplining a child. Now, of course, don't worry if your parents do use physical force, or perhaps they are very strict. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily an authoritarian personality. It just means that they're more authoritarian in some of their choices. And so we see that this is where some of the damage might come. So it says they gave love and affection only when their child behaved. So, of course, what the child is simply learning is that they are not good enough unless they obey, and because they've been very critical. Now, this is going to be something that will really create large elements of resentment and pain and anger towards the parent, but of course they can't do anything about it, because it says you have fear of reprisal, because if the parent is demanding absolute loyalty, how dare you question them? And so this is where he turns to his Freudian roots, and he says, of course, we're going to use a defense mechanism. So there's two defense mechanisms that are likely here: repression, and perhaps that's why you might show lots of anger. But of course, the key one actually is this displacement. I'm going to move that resentment, anger, frustration onto somebody who is weaker than me. And of course, that's where it's building those stereotypes. And so we find that they are very obedient to high authority, and of course, hate those people who are inferior to them. And that's quite a good explanation as to why they will be going to be more obedient. So there we go. We have the authoritarian personality explained. It is a little bit repetitive. I would say just read through it and check that you do understand how being having the authoritarian personality will make you more obedient. The evaluation points, we've got two real main points here. There's a bit of research support. I quite like this research, and I use the word link in my point, but I also refer to relationship. So there's research that shows that there's a relationship between being obedient and authoritarian personality. And the reason I like this is it actually comes from Milgram himself, who worked with a prominent person who worked in the field of personality called Elms. And what he took is 20 of his participants who had actually obeyed, either gone all the way to 450 or met the criteria of obedience, and also 20 defiant, in other words, those people who had stopped. And what we got to appreciate is that they weren't looking specifically at authoritarian personality. They did a whole bunch of things. There's a range of personality tests, okay, including the F scale that they were taken. And he also asked them some open-ended questions. So personality tests will probably be something that are quite quantitative. You'll have a score that will put you in a particular category, or open-ended will be qualitative questions that will get you to talk about your parents and about your attitudes towards the experimenter. And we find that this is where things get really interesting. Now, the first bit is to say, well, actually, he didn't feel there's very little difference in general personality. So something like Myers-Briggs, it wouldn't be Myers-Briggs, but Eysenck or people like that who did personalities back then, it didn't really make a difference what personality you had, other than scored highly on the F scale. So other than the F scale, there was no relationship. And of course, here we're seeing that if they score high in the F scale, they're more likely to have been the person who obeyed. He also then, in the interviews, see that they're less close to their fathers, and also they felt that there was a authority figure, specifically the experimenter, was more important. And of course, this links with our understanding of the authoritarian personality. So less close to your father is quite simple. If you have built up all this resentment over the years, you're likely to be close to your parents. You probably move out of the house as soon as you can in order to escape that. But also, it has further agreement that there's a that they viewed the experimenter kind of more importantly. But of course, all this does is show us that link once again. So I use the word relationship. So this is ultimately a correlational research. And so I do decide to have a however point, a point that questions whether this is a valid point to make about the link between authoritarianism and obedience. And of course, when we do this, we find that we have an impossible situation. I can't draw a conclusion from a correlation. All I can show is the relationship. Okay, and I gave some silly examples in class for you to have a look at. So I wouldn't say that my putting on bigger shoes will cause me to grow, even though there might be a correlation between shoe size and height, because there's always other factors. And so we've got to appreciate even for those Milgram participants who did obey, there could be other reasons why they did obey, including legitimate authority as an explanation. And so that's something we mustn't forget, really, is that, of course, situational variables could directly counter the authoritarian personality. Milgram's own research can counter it. So the second evaluation point is just looking at limitation, and it's asking us to think about a country's population. Is it likely that a country like Germany that did kill 6 million Jews, the real world, that they all would have had authoritarian personality? And of course, it's not likely. There must be some other anti-Semitic behavior, and not because of their personalities. And so I just give you another example. One of the theories that could explain the Nazi genocide of the Jews would be the social identity theory, a bit like what we did when we looked at conformity, types of conformity. One of the types was identification. So Abrams and Hogg came up with social identity theory, said that when we identify with a social group, we do the things that kind of make us part of that group. And so, of course, at the time, the German people were identifying with the anti-Semitic Nazi state because they were identifying with how Hitler was saying that we need to kind of make Germany kind of great again, and we mustn't be apologetic for the war and all these types of things. So they probably scapegoated, they probably kind of blamed the Jews for the state that the country were in. So there we literally have 2 points that do kind of talk about authoritarian personality. The only one that I haven't done much with is this concept that possibly there is other explanations that could help understand obedience, and that's situational factors. So please don't forget that. And this becomes relevant when we look at the types of questions. We have 2 questions here. One's a short question, one is a short essay. They want us to focus on explanations of obedience. And what is really key here is that we need to know what they're asking us to do. So briefly outline, so in other words, explain how the authoritarian personality makes you more obedient, and then evaluate it. So you won't need kind of too many points there, but certainly you need to talk about it. I'm just going to show here, part of the mark scheme says answers that just describe the authoritarian personality only gets a maximum of 3 marks. So we need to kind of always try and explain how it leads to obedience. And then, of course, one of the evaluation points that they're considering here is it says here, Milgram can be readily explained by situational factors. So in other words, there are situational factors that could explain this type of research. I hope that kind of makes sense. I'm going to finish the video here, and I trust that these videos have been useful in the long run for you. Okay.